Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Azera webinar on EU and UK ETS in focus. Thanks for taking the time to join us. We'll make sure that we're on time today so that you can join your local Mardi Gras parade if you have your costume ready. My name is Yasmina, and I'm the head of Aviation Sustainability at Azera, where one of my main areas of focus is aircraft operators compliance management. And since I've worked in business aviation for about 15 years, I know the struggles the operators are facing firsthand. So I'm joined today by my colleague Anand. Hello, Anand. Our Mr. Innovation, as we like to call him, or officially Chief Innovation Officer of Azera. And we're both very excited to be hosting our expert panelist, Guido Harling, the CEO and founder, hello Guido, the CEO and founder of ETS Verification GmbH. So this is Azera's first webinar in 2024, and there's been a lot happening since our last one. One of the biggest recent achievements for our team was the Top Innovator Award from the Uplink Sustainable Aviation Challenge by World Economic Forum, where our innovation, Azera CELESTE, was assessed by the panel of judges from commercial aviation and investment groups specializing in aviation. So we are very, very proud of this recognition. What's on the agenda today? Let's have a look. We'll start with an overview of EU ETS and UK ETS compliance regulation for 2023 and look at what's in store from 2024 onwards. We'll continue with Guido's part, where he will present the challenges in verification processes, after which I will present Azera's emission management tool, Azera CELESTE, which was recently certified for 2023 aviation emissions compliance by Verifavia, another achievement we're also very proud of. And last but not least, Anand will talk about SAF in compliance schemes and Azera's solutions for SAF. We plan for about 45 minutes of presentation time and 15 minutes of discussions at the end in the Q&A. So let's begin without further ado and jump in head first into our EU and UK emissions trading scheme overview applicable for 2023 compliance. Compliance schemes operate in a similar way. Aircraft operator has to monitor its full scope flight emissions in order to assess if it needs to comply with the scheme or not. If below the de minimis threshold, then no reporting is required. EU ETS is a special case because it differentiates between two full scopes. There's extended full scope, which is intended to prevent aircraft operators from falling below the de minimis threshold of EU ETS simply because of the interaction of different emission trading schemes. So the extended full scope includes all flights departing or arriving at an airport within EEA, whereas the full scope excludes flights from Switzerland and from UK to EEA. The reduced scope, which constitutes the so-called aviation activity for aircraft operator and is indicative of reporting and surrendering obligations, focuses only on intra-EEA flights, as well as departures from EEA to Switzerland and to UK. If we look at the UK, on the other hand, it only has two scopes, which is great. Full scope flights means flights departing from or arriving in an airport situated in the UK, Gibraltar, Switzerland, or EEA state, including outermost regions. Reduced scope flights include domestic UK flights, flights between UK and Gibraltar, UK to EEA without OMRs, and Great Britain to Switzerland. Now let's have a closer look into practical examples of changes in scopes applicable for 2023 compliance. Next slide, please, Anand. The first practical example are flights between Switzerland and the UK. Departure from Switzerland to UK logically falls under Swiss ETS reduced scope. The other way around, however, things get more complicated. Only the flights from Great Britain to Switzerland fall under the reduced scope of UK ETS, whereas flights from Northern Ireland to Switzerland don't. Secondly, you need to apply correct segregation of flights from or to EEA outermost regions, which are excluded from EU ETS reduced scope until 31st December of 2023. Example, flights between Tenerife, Canary Islands, and France, they don't fall under EU ETS reduced scope. However, the emissions from flights within the same outermost region are included in EU ETS reduced scope. So in practice, Tenerife and Gran Canaria are both islands in Spanish outermost region called Canary Islands, and the flights between these islands do fall under EU ETS. Whereas, for example, flights between Martinique and Guadeloupe, even though they're both outermost regions of France, do not fall under EU ETS because they're not the same outermost region. The next slide. What is for 2024 EU ETS compliance then? The EU has recently enacted several laws to ensure we are on track with the Fit for 55 legislative package, which aims to ensure the EU policies are in line with EU climate targets of reducing net GHG emissions by 55% by 2030 and achieving net zero emissions by 2050. So the revision of the ETS Aviation Directive introduces a number of changes to the existing regulatory framework. One of them is the reform clarify that targets set under CORSIA apply to flights outside the EEA that participate in CORSIA, while the EU ETS applies to intra-EEA flights. It's also important to note that free emission allowances in the aviation sector will be phased out by 2026, meaning that all emission allowances in the aviation sector will then be allocated by auction only. Next slide. Free allocation for the year 2024 and 2025 will be based on the 23 verified emissions from flights covered by the EU ETS for the geographical scope valid from 2024. Emissions from the additional flights in the year 2023 need to be reported by the operators to allow the calculation of these free allocations. Another big change is the emission factor for jet kerosene change, which is will be changing from 3.15 to 3.16 to align with CORSIA. The change will be valid for Swiss ETS as well as EU ETS, but not for UK ETS. They stay with the same emission factor. Reforms also require aircraft operators to annually report on non-CO2 aviation effects from January 2025. That's less than a year away. The European Commission is obligated to adopt implementing legislation by August 2024. So as you can see, there's enough content for us to produce several additional webinars in the coming months just by diving deeper into some of the changes that I've just mentioned. Let's look at changes in scopes from 2024 onwards, specifically for the outermost regions. Yeah, we can skip that slide. It's very detailed. The next one is maybe a bit nicer to see. So all flights between outermost region and another region of the EEA and flights between departing from outermost region and arriving into Switzerland and the UK will be included in EU ETS from 2024. But of course, it's never as simple as that. There must be exceptions to the rule. So there are flights that will be excluded until December 2030. If you look at the bottom part of the slide, you'll see that the flights between OMRs and the OMR and the state, when the OMR is a part of the same state, will be excluded. So if I give you a practical example, that's, for example, Tenerife, which is included in the Canary Islands, which is an OMR of Spain. Flights between Tenerife and Spain will be excluded. On the other hand, Tenerife to France, for example, will be included into EU ETS. Then there's flights between the same OMR the ones that were included in 2023 are now excluded from 2024 onwards. So these are the flights, the middle picture over there on the slide, as you see. This is an example of a flight between Tenerife and Gran Canaria, for example. They are both islands within the same outermost region. And the third example of exemption are flights between OMRs in the same state. That's, for example, between Madeira and Azores, which are both Portuguese OMRs, but not the same OMR. Next slide. Additionally to what I just said, if you're performing French domestic flights, make sure to check that you're not subject to additional offsetting obligations in France. And when it comes to CORSIA, surrendering and offsetting obligations overlap is now resolved, finally. Those flights that would otherwise fall under CORSIA offsetting requirements, as well as EU, Swiss, or UK, no longer have CORSIA offsetting obligations, only reporting obligations. So if we look at a practical example, a flight from France to Germany used to have EU ETS surrendering obligations as well as CORSIA offsetting obligations. But from 2024 onwards, this flight will only have EU ETS surrender obligations and CORSIA reporting obligations. Well, CORSIA and EU ETS reporting obligations. Okay, next slide. In the next section, I'll look at the aircraft operator's compliance challenges. First, the threshold. We all know they are not so easy to read sometimes. Both UK and EU ETS distinguish private and commercial thresholds when it needs to qualify if an aircraft operator has to comply with the scheme or not. So EU ETS looks at extended full scope, and UK ETS looks at full scope emissions. For commercial operator, the threshold is either emissions greater or equal to 10,000 tons of emissions, or more than 243 flights in any of the 3 consecutive 4-month periods. For private operators, the threshold is much lower, and it doesn't take into account the number of flights. There are 2 other thresholds that are important for aircraft operators. The first one is small emitter threshold, which looks at the full scope flights and allows the use of simplified tools for reporting, like small emitter tool, for example. And the threshold that allows simplified reporting without verification when using Eurocontrol ETS support facility report. So when you check all of these thresholds, you will know whether or not you need to comply in the first place and how your reporting process will look like. To conclude my part of the presentation, you move to the next slide. I wanted to highlight the updates in Eurocontrol support facility. The version from 15th of January was amended to comply with 2023 MRV requirements. The ETS support facility will be using the latest EU and Swiss annual emission report templates. And an additional sheet has been added into the EU annual emission report template called Annex 2023, which shall be used to report the additional 2023 emissions to allow the recalculation of free allocations for 2024 and 2025. The emissions from flights covered, the flights that will be included in this particular annex are the emissions from flights covered in 2023, but exempt in 2024 and 2025, which are flights between the same OMR, so Tenerife, Gran Canaria, remember? And emissions from flights not covered in 2023, but covered in 2024 and onwards, which are all flights between outermost regions and another region of the EEA, and flights departing from outermost region and arriving in Switzerland or the UK. This reporting is voluntary, so in case the additional flights are not reported by the operator, the Commission will seek the assistance of the Eurocontrol to determine total emissions. Okay, I would now hand over to Guido to talk about challenges the operators and verifiers face in the verification process. Please, Guido, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yasmina. Yeah, that was very comprehensive, and I can see that there might be more than one question, and I was told that we have time for questions in the end of this webinar. Feel free to use the chat to type in your questions so we can read them in advance. Yeah, let me say a couple of words about ETS verification or company. So Anand, if you will forward the slides and one more click. So this is us. We are a verification body for EU ETS, Swiss ETS, for CORSIA, and most recently for UK ETS. We also do carbon footprint verifications. This is kind of the voluntary part of the audit versus the emission trading schemes. This is the mandatory part. Yeah, we have a website, and I guess most of you guys or the audience knows me from conferences. Let's move on to some of the challenges that come up in verification. And this slide is not animated. I just want to tell or alert the audience to the fact that in order to report your emissions, there is a variety of tools available. Tools meaning, yeah, the easiest way is, of course, you create an Excel spreadsheet, meaning you use the Excel sheet that is provided either by the Commission or by ICAO for CORSIA. But unfortunately, in the EU, there is a mixture of electronic tools or websites. And you can see the UK has its own system called METS. I have to admit, Germany has also a very complicated system. It's called the FMS. There's a system that's used in Sweden, and there's also a system just recently started in Turkey for recording the CORSIA emissions. So if you are just now at this point in time starting to familiarize yourself with the emission reporting, be aware that there is a multitude or is a country-specific means to report your emissions. And to make matters worse, if you are an operator based in Turkey, but you have to report to Germany, you have to not only feed the German FMS for the EU ETS reporting, but you also have to feed the Turkish system. Kind of, this is how it is. Reach out to us or to Azira for guidance. We can, of course, help you get set up and provide you with the links to these tools. Final word about those tools. They will mostly work with, I mean, you can hand key your emissions, but there's also an upload function. And I'm pretty certain Nand or Yasmina will tell you what their system can do to support those tools. All right, let's move on to one more slide from my side and just click on through all the bullet points. Well, being a verifier, I just want to alert you to very common mistakes so you can avoid them when you are creating your emission report. And starting out with mistakes that are happening on the CORSIA emission report, you have to make sure that when you populate your CORSIA emission report template, that you stick to what you have agreed in your monitoring plan with regards to you want to report by aerodrome pair or city pair versus on a state level. So it's a different way of condensing or combining those individual flights in your emission report template. And you can actually see from the screenshot that this is a summary by aerodrome pair. Yeah, it's very small on my screen. Next issue that's rare, but it happens, is of course if you have like a triangle flight or multi-leg flight that you want to really capture each leg as the one that creates emissions. Wrong aircraft type, wrong ICAO code, so the wrong 4-letter ICAO code also gives us a headache, especially when we are creating, or when we are working with CERT, CERT is a tool provided by ICAO that will help small emitters to calculate their emissions by themselves, but it will not do any calculation if it doesn't recognize the four-letter ICAO code for the aircraft. Same applies, of course, to the aerodrome four-letter ICAO code. Also, that you want to make sure that this is the one that is like part of ICAO standard. Yeah, then if you are creating the report, you want to make sure that for CORSIA, you exclude domestic flights. And of course, for an EU ETS report, you provide the verifier or the tool that you are feeding with those domestic flights. A very, very common error that we will discover in an audit is that you are forgetting, if you are in a wet lease relationship, to obtain the flight information from your wet lease partner, the one you have leased the aircraft to, and vice versa. If someone leases an aircraft from you, you want to give him the flights that are recorded on your aircraft. Yeah. And another issue, error that we commonly find is, yes, there are exemptions in emission reporting. And the most straightforward and common example is a humanitarian flight. And yeah, you might include this flight, but you don't have to. But if you are excluding it, you need to provide evidence to the verifier. It's easy when the fact that this was a humanitarian relief flight has been indicated as such when you file the flight plan. Then there is a HUM coding in the flight plan that can be retrieved from Eurocontrol, for instance. If there is no such thing, we will take as evidence like a contract or a purchase order from any relief organization that has chartered your aircraft. Final thing that we also encounter is if you populate both the tool from Azira or the verification template that the auditor, so we have a tool, you provide the tool and you give us your source data. You want to make sure that for the calculation, we need the fuel in mass and not in volume. And if you, unless no, this is how we need to have it. So you are allowed to multiply it with the standard density for kerosene, or you have to capture the actual density. But we need to understand what what this value is in your emission report. Is it mass or is it volume? Is it gallons or is it like kilos or pounds? Yeah, those are the most common mistakes. I wish, of course, all of you best of luck in your emission reporting, and yeah, feel free to approach me for any further questions. But this was my part of the slides. Over to Jasmina.
Thank you very much, Guido. That was very informative, and we'll speak more in the Q&A section. I see the questions are already popping up, so thank you for that, all the participants. Before I move to my next part, I'll ask Anand to launch a small poll for the participants to answer. Anand, if you can please activate the poll. So please reply to, what are your pain points in emissions management? You may choose more than one pain point. I'll give you a couple more seconds. All right, has everybody voted?
Yeah, I think we're good to go. I'll just share the results shortly.
Perfect. Thanks. Okay, so we've come full circle now with changes in scopes, compliance requirements, thresholds, and verification difficulties. Aha, wow, okay, let's just tackle these results. Oh, wow, this is very interesting. Flight segregation tops it with 10%, 43%, sorry. Oh, wow, okay. Yeah. Let's save these for Q&A later. These are very interesting. Thank you for those who participated. I'd like to briefly now show you how CELESTE can help aircraft operators to measure, manage, and mitigate their emissions. CELESTE gets, next slide, please. So this is our new software. Well, new. We've launched it last year at EBase. We've just been, as I said before, verified for 2023 aviation emission compliance by Verifavia. And what CELESTE does is it gets data information by connecting via API to your flight scheduling software. We're currently connected to Skylex, and we'll be connecting to Leon software shortly as well. The flights are then being segregated into respective compliance markets, and their emissions are being measured according to approved fuel monitoring methods. At the moment, we have SET and Method B. The others are coming depending on the client's requests. CELESTE also detects data gaps so that you can manage them in a timely manner. I'll dive deeper into that shortly. And you can also extract emission reports and visualize your emission status in interactive dashboards. And on top of all of that, it's also the first platform offering mitigation products all in one place. So voluntary carbon credits, sustainable aviation fuel, as well as allowances. Next slide. For today's session, I wanted to focus on how Azera CELESTE addresses data gaps by showing remarks that prompt the user to check the errors in their flight scheduling system, correct them, and send the updated information back to CELESTE. As you can see on the screen, there's a couple of remarks shown. So CELESTE is showing a remark when it cannot detect previous flight, for example, if there's a first flight in the sequence of flights for one aircraft. Then it's also showing several remarks connected to Method B calculation. If it cannot calculate Method B due to error in fuel figures, and if specifically there's, for example, fuel end or block on fuel figure missing. It also detects missing flights whenever previous arrival is different from current departure location. Also, if you're using Method B for your calculations, the SET calculations are always done for all the flights as well. So if there's any missing data, the SET calculation is there. We're using the latest Eurocontrol SET version. The calculations are available for all flights. It also does not, of course, it does not show any remarks if the Method B is calculated correctly. As well, if you're uploading the flights, for example, if you're not connected to Skylex or in future Leon, you can also upload flights via CSV. And the system does not allow 2 flights to happen at the same time on the same tail number. So this is also a prevention of you actually uploading several duplicated flights. Can we move forward? Yes, so now we're moving on to Anand's section. He'll also present Azera CELESTE and the SAF solutions that are in Azera CELESTE. So please, Anand, go ahead.
Thanks, Yasmina. Good afternoon, everyone. Now we're just diving into the clean fuels section, and I'll start off with a short poll because I think there are several topics here: book and claim, physical SAF, and it's just good to know where the audience is, what system they traditionally use or have been using so far. So bear with me, I'm just running another poll. Perfect. So that's the last one. And now you can sit back and relax. I'll show you the results. That's definitely interesting. I see a lot more on the physical side. So physical SAF consumption, slightly lesser on the book and claim, actually just not even, just one of the users. So that's That's interesting. So maybe I can just skip my book and claim side, but we also have some of the participants using both physical SAF and book and claim. So yeah, maybe just keep those in there. All right, let's begin. So I think it's good to start off with saying that the refuel EU mandate, specifically in Europe, is using the stick approach for spurring SAF production, starting with next year at 2% of all SAF that's going to be sold at airports, being 2% of all fuel that's going to be sold at airports is going to be SAF. While it is a good policy move, it really doesn't incentivize new production capacities beyond those incremental targets, so beyond 2%, for example, which means that when you don't have enough oversupply of SAF at those locations, prices will end up staying on the higher side. What we've seen most recently in the last 2 years is that several airports have kicked off these regional incentive programs to spur the uptake of SAF. And what they're doing is providing some kind of subsidies which shield airfares from these new price burdens of SAF introductions. And some of these incentives, I've listed them on the slide. They're in the form of subsidies, like I said, but on a per ton basis of physical SAF that's purchased at any airport. Here, Heathrow Airport is kind of leading the charge with the highest annual funding cap of 10 million euros. And within some of these schemes, you'll find that there's also a per airline cap. So it's not just the 10 million euros taken over by the largest consumer of SAF or the most profiteering airlines in the region, but it's also a case where others can take advantage of the scheme. And so SAF becomes more widely adopted and not just concentrated among the larger operators. There are other fueling restrictions in place, specifically specified by Refuel EU, such as tankering, for example. Tankering is where flights that arrive into EU come in with enough fuel for the return trip, so that they don't have to comply with Refuel EU saying that we don't have to refuel, so why take on board SAF and follow the mandate? So this has been classified as tankering and clearly not disallowed from the regulation. Of course, this is not the start, so there are going to be more airports in the future that will emerge and kind of spur the demand for physical SAF, hopefully beyond the 2%. So, production capacity keeps growing eventually to meet those incremental targets and beyond. Specifically within the EU ETS also, you have 20 million SAF allowances, which will be handed out for free between the years 2024 and 2030. And again, those will go towards incentivizing aircraft operators to kind of use SAF more. In a sense, the SAF allowance will be the same price of the EUA allowance, and will be, slightly reduce the cost of using SAF. But I think it's also good to address how complicated or what challenges you have in consuming physical SAF in EU at the moment. Let's start with the first one, which is, of course, moving the physical SAF to the location where it's needed. And when you do that, you also add additional emissions as a result of transportation. And what's happening really there is that in the case of proof of sustainability, that document needs to be refreshed, and the new carbon intensity of the fuel needs to be shown in there, which is the additional component of transportation of the fuel itself. So at the end, you're getting a slightly diluted emission reduction claim, which is not the best for your money. There's also the question of minimum capacities. And so you're requesting a fuel supplier for the product, and for him to move the fuel across EU, it should have to be large enough a capacity to be economically viable. And that's where sending half a tank of SAF doesn't make sense. So the question again lies, does the airline have enough demand projections to order 10 trucks of SAF at a time to be interesting enough for a fuel supplier? There's also, once the SAF, of course, arrives at the location, there's also the cost of storage. So you need to store the fuel in a tank long enough till it's over time consumed by different clients. In some cases, you don't know really how soon that fuel is going to be consumed. So you're adding to storage inventory costs for storing that SAF on your location. And this, of course, can increase the cost of SAF in itself and become a strong barrier to adoption. The last 2 points are kind of very straightforward. Regional unavailability of SAF in general, this we all know very well, and intermittent supply because of feedstock constraints or simply production constraints. So I think it's worth just starting from the basics here and book and claim. Just bear with me as I go through explaining how book and claim transaction works. So this is specifically for cases where physical SAF is not available in the region, or also the airline is not able to get the SAF that they want. In this case, really, book and claim can really apply as a solution because here you're able to consume any SAF in the world by essentially decoupling the environmental attributes from that SAF. And thereon, you call that SAF jet fuel. So let's say if it's in North America, there's a fuel supplier that has a lot of physical SAF available, but in EU, there's currently no supply. So the airline in EU can book and claim SAF by just paying for the delta between jet fuel and physical SAF. And that delta corresponds to the environmental attributes of SAF, and the airline in EU can still make the emission reduction claim. But let's discuss the claim part a bit more later. But for now, it's obviously a simpler solution because you can now easily scale the usage of SAF without moving the fuel to a new location. And that's where it opens the door to choice. So now an airline can choose, okay, I'd like to use used cooking oil as a feedstock or SAF derived from municipal solid waste, as an example. It opens those doors, and there can be more discussions on price and negotiations on price, which at the moment is kind of very restricted. At Azera, what we built is this platform to take care of those book and claim transactions. So we've built our own book and claim ledger. We've used the methodology from the Sustainable Aviation Buyers Alliance. They published the methodology openly last year. And we've used their guidance to issue the same type of serial number of credits. We also use the SAFC framework from the World Economic Forum, Clean Skies for Tomorrow. Those are really the guidelines for now that we're using. Of course, over the last few months, we've had 2 new registries for SAF come up, SABA and RSB. Traditionally, we would also want to move towards in that direction where we can move our SAF transactions onto those mainstream registries, because that's where the systems and the processes are perfected for transparency and for trust. And that's where we stand. Just quickly explaining to you how we do it at the moment. On the right-hand side, you have a buyer. So the EU airlines that would like to buy the SAF emission reduction claim. The first step is for them to purchase or to give a notification to Azera to buy SAF. We would issue what's known as what we call as the SAFC certificate, which states, okay, that's on paper, that's really the amount of emission reductions you're paying for. On our side, we would then source the SAF in the back, upload the proof of sustainability. Of course, there's question marks around whether it's available or not. Our purpose there is to really ensure that we have, if not the proof of sustainability, but additional equally suitable documents to support that claim, along with any proof of uplifts, purchase records of the SAF, and the chain of custody till it arrives in the aerodrome or the airport of final consumption. We upload that into the system, issue the certificates for the serial numbers. In step 5, that's where we give you the buyer a SAF emission reduction certificate, along with all of those documents. And annually, we do an audit, so all of these transactions are audited. I'm happy to answer any questions. For now, I think I'll move on. So just coming back to the claim question, which is how well can you use a SAF book and claim reduction in your existing ETS scheme? Well, for EU ETS, today you cannot. It's not included yet, but there is an ongoing study where they will launch the feasibility report, most likely the second half of this year, and we can expect something concrete. And it's the UK ETS, which right now on paper accepts book and claim. There's also a bit of leeway in the case of proof of sustainability and it's not provided, which can then be substituted with certificates from the sustainability certification scheme like RSB or ISCC, which is great because there's been a lot of noise in the last year over between aircraft operators, fuel providers, over the same concept of proof of sustainability not being available always. Besides that, I think there are other requirements, like the physical SAF must be delivered to an aerodrome before 31st March of T+1, where T is the compliance year. So let's say 2023, you would have to submit the claim. The SAF would have to be delivered to the aerodrome before 31st March of 2024. Also, the operator is required to sign a statement that there has been no double counting of the fuel. So it's more a deterrence at this time. The regulator is not really checking it. In a sense, there's only an external verification of the reduction claim that has been done. However, if there is a case of false information, then there will be certain penalties applied for false information. So here's what Azera does for SAF, really, and this is where maybe we can help some of those complications. Firstly, on the physical side, we are able to attribute fuel uplifts to any flight that we record on CELESTE. So here's where the operator can easily go in and say, okay, I've consumed used cooking oil as a feedstock. That's my total emission reductions for this particular flight with this tail number. And when you export that as a report, you also have those same information in the report. So it makes life a lot easier because throughout the year, your operation staff are going to be recording SAF in the back. And at the end of the year, you have this really nice report that says, okay, that's everything that's been done. It's also, we aspire to have an emission reduction template. So basically, when there's an option to then export all of your SAF reductions in a template that's accepted by the EU ETS scheme or the UK ETS scheme. Another interesting point that we've came across when we were speaking to some of the operators is assignment of the uplift to either the arrival airport or the departure airport, and that's an important one to have for any reporting schemes that you report to. On the book and claim side, really, if you see the screenshot, I've added in 3 stages of SAF. The first one is pending. That's when the operator sales staff book SAF on a particular flight. So the status of the flight is then pending. On our side, once we assign SAF to that flight, we then issue the SAF C certificate, the first stage, and the status is then changed to issued, which is in blue here. The third stage is completed, which is where we have confirmation of retirement from the fuel supplier, and we're able to provide exactly the details of the SAF, including where it was retired and when. I think that's enough for now. Let's jump into the Q&A. If I could have all the panelists back in and with the cameras on. I have a few questions here already, so give me a few minutes and we can get started.
We've already replied some in the chat as well directly.
Yeah, absolutely. I just see a few general questions there. I'll just kick those ones out first.
Yeah, go ahead.
Will the slides be available for download after the presentation? Yes, they will. Just reach out to us. Yasmina, if you can put our email in the chat window, and then everyone can just share their questions or if their requests for slides. I have a question on CELESTE. I understand that CELESTE is addressed to operators for Scope 1 emissions. Am I right? Yes, that's correct. The first one that we want to take care of is flight emissions. And that's really how CELESTE is configured to automatically capture data of flights and calculate CO2 emissions on top of those and assign them to the right carbon market. There's a question specifically on SAF. I'll just take this one as well. The 31st March deadline is really for when they first issued the document on when they first issued the document, the deadline that they placed in there was 31st March. The reporting deadlines for the ETS schemes have been extended now, if I'm not wrong. So that document is due for an update. So in a sense, if you do have a SAF, physical SAF being claimed under an emission reduction, then the SAF needs to be moved to the aerodrome by 31st March. And I suspect that it could be extended.
Okay, I answered a question on tankering, which now disappeared from the chat, but I'll repeat it again. And it was whether tankering is no longer allowed. And the fact of the matter is that operators are required to assure that they uplift at least, I guess 90% is the figure of their aviation fuel at the EU airport of their departure when they are flying out of the EU, which is part of the regulation refuel initiative by the EU. So very little tankering allowed, I should say.
Thanks.
Yeah, book and claim. I saw a question. Maybe I take that one too as well. Book and claim is currently not allowed under the EU ETS. As Anand just said, they are working on, I guess, identifying a framework, and then maybe in future years after 2024, we can also not only we can also use book and claim. 2 words about this. Maybe we have to differentiate in the wording. The wording EU ETS speaks about biofuel and versus CORSIA speaks about SAF, and the EU ETS related biofuel has to qualify under the RED Renewable Energy Directive #2 scheme, and that makes it hard to reconcile at this point in time book and claim emission reduction claims with biofuel emission reduction claims.
Thanks, Guido. I see another question there. So specifically around the SAF ETS allowances, which I mentioned will be assigned for free between 2024 and 2030. So the question is, are the 20 million SAF ETS allowances available to book and claim SAF buyers or physical SAF buyers? So for now, our understanding is that it's in the context of the EU ETS, since book and claim is not acceptable at the moment, those 20 million SAF allowances will go to physical buyers of SAF. That could change in the next year.
Yeah. And first claims for these 20 million allowances, I mean, you're not getting all, but for part of it can be placed in 2025 for the emissions of 2024.
Yes, I think there's a follow-up question to what you said, Guido, on the book and claim being accepted. So let's make the distinction here. There's the EU ETS and the UK ETS. So the EU ETS does not allow book and claim. The UK ETS does allow book and claim as of this year. That's correct.
Yeah. For EU ETS, there are 2 methods available how you can claim your RED II qualified SAF, and this is more the direct method where you can actually have or prove that you are using your fuel for a specific flight, or there is a simplified method, so to speak, and that's you claim your SAF by purchase record at a specific airport. And the only thing we as verifiers only need to audit is the fact that you're not over-claiming more SAF or claiming more SAF than you actually had emissions in EU ETS, intra-EU flights. Yeah.
Guido, there's a question that I wanted to ask you, which is on the reporting deadline. So can you clarify the 31st March deadline? Is that specifically for reporting and surrender? How has that changed?
The reporting deadline as for the 2023 emission report has just recently been changed by the EU to be now the submission of a verified emission report changed to 30th of September 2024 for the 2023 emissions, but not every member state has actually transposed this EU directive into local law. So unfortunately, Germany still sticks with end of March deadline. Yeah, that's how it is.
That's going to be a challenge in itself, I guess.
So it
Especially
is depending on the member states, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. There's a lot of interest in SAF.
yeah, that's clear. So I think we've answered more or less the SAF questions.
I might have said something wrong. I just listened to what I said. What I was referring to, the 30th of September is the surrendering deadline. Yeah, just don't let me confuse you. The surrendering deadline.
So the ETS, so the reporting one is still 31st March.
Yes.
Thanks.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
So Guido, a question for you, which is specifically around SAF emission reduction claims, since we spoke about that for a while. Have you most recently verified a claim like that, and what issues do you see there?
Yeah, the biggest issue is, of course, well, first we have to start from the beginning. We haven't verified the CORSIA emission reduction claim. We only have verified EU ETS emission reduction claims. And yeah, it has to start off with the fact that the operator, first of all, has to describe its purchases of SAF in its monitoring plan. So whenever someone has bought SAF during the course of 2023 and wants to claim it, and of course provides documentation to us for the verification, we have to go back to the monitoring plan where the process has been described, which kind of SAF he intends to use, and of course which claiming method. I just mentioned there's an option 1, the more detailed method, and there's a simplified method, option 2, which method the operator chooses. Then the fact of the matter that the operator has to still, in both methods, keep track of the RED II certificate of the individual SAF batch he has purchased. We need to see the purchase record, the certificate of sustainability, which is kind of like, this is a RED II qualified fuel source. What else do we need to see? Purchase record, yeah, and we need to see the volume. And then we can apply the emission reduction. So it's a little bit of a complicated math. More importantly, the pre-work that has to be done, like documenting it in your monitoring plan and keeping the related records so they can prove to your auditor. And it can be as simple as an Excel template where you say, we bought these kind of batches over the course of 2023. Then we can audit and then it will be approved. So that has been done. The only caveat here is that for Germany, again, and for Austria, they not only want the proof of sustainability under RED II criteria as documented in the certificate, it needs to be logged in a registry. Germany, it's called NABESI, and Austria also has its own registry. That makes, and I don't think any fuel supplier at this point in time has logged its certificate in these tools because there's way too much demand. They don't want to go that route. I don't want to speculate. So it's even more difficult to do this. I think with the emergence of an EU-wide registry, this will be way more easy and way more common, which shall be available for use in 2024.
Yeah, it's not a good sign to
Good
see.
start. No, it's not.
Emerging there. Yeah. It would be good to have a central one, like you said. Question for you, Yasmina, specifically on the EU ETS part and emissions management, right? How is the aircraft operator identified under an emissions trading scheme, especially with respect to wet leases, because that's always been a pain point?
That's a good question. So the EU ETS and also UK ETS scheme, as well as Eurocontrol support facility, they all identify the operator as per the ICAO designator of the operator in the field 7 of ICAO flight plan. So within the call sign. And if, for example, there's no ICAO designator there, if there's registration of the aircraft, then they use the field 18, which should include the ICAO designator of the operator, 3-letter ICAO designator of the operator. If that's not the case, then they look at the registration itself and they look at where which operator is actually operating this aircraft as as per the registration. In terms of wet leases, Guido, you were talking about it in detail. I mean, maybe explain a bit more in detail now.
Yeah, things become tricky when you are doing a wet lease in or a wet lease out for that matter, so that there is the obligation. I mean, the wet lease flight should be recorded and fly under the call sign of the lessee. And so a typical emission report coming out of the lessor's flight ops system would not have this flight as a record. So the lessee needs to provide emission-related information like departure, arrival, aerodrome, block on fuel or fuel uplift figures to the lessor so that he can include this, or vice versa, in its emission report. So this is typically an issue where we see a difference. And it's hard to track actually if you don't have a third-party source. So you would go and follow, and this is actually where Azira's tool will help, follow the pattern or the rotation of the individual aircraft itself, so that you can see, whoops, this lands at one airport but departs from a totally other one, and there's a 3-week time gap, so this aircraft was probably leased out to someone. Meaning, for me, I prefer to work with tools like that make verification easier. So it's actually it makes better airlines on top of things that we also audit, but it's easy for us to audit with a tool where the data is already pre-qualified. But it is.
That's definitely true. We've seen that also with recent check I did for one of the operators where a Swiss flight, there was an error actually in the Eurocontrol support facility, and you might have noticed if you do have flights in Switzerland that you have received a notification that there was an error in February 2023 calculations. The flights were not included as per the new regulation. And it was because of what we found in Azera CELESTE from the data we got from the flight scheduling system of the operator. So there you go. Even support facility might have errors you're not aware of, and
especially this year is going to be even more because you're moving back and forth from the OMR changes in the rules, so it's going to be a bit more complex. So I think we're out of time at this point. Yasmina,